Hi, welcome everybody to Finding Truth. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about evolution, a little bit of evidence for creationism, and then as well, we're going to touch a little bit on Christianity. And tonight we have Dr. Rana with us from Reasons to Believe. This is the first time that he's going to be on our channel. We have had Hugh Ross with us, and it was great. We had two wonderful conversations with them. Really appreciate their ministry and the things that they have been doing. So, Dr. Rana, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for our audience?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, Santiago, thank you so much for having me. And as you mentioned, I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. And the objective of our organization is to demonstrate how the latest discoveries in science provide evidence for God's existence and the reliability of Scripture. And we approach these questions from an old earth creationist perspective, which we think is the best perspective to integrate the data from science as well as the information that we have from Scripture into a coherent framework. I'm a biochemist by training, and I've been with Reasons to Believe for 22 years now on a full-time basis, and had an involvement with the ministry prior to that on a volunteer basis. So I've been involved in the science-faith conversation for a quarter of a century or more. As a scientist, of course, I have interest in how does, again, science influence our faith as Christians, and how does our faith as Christians influence the enterprise of science?
All right. So I guess one of the things that I was really interested in asking you about was the fact that, sometimes, like, for example, from my background, I came from a background that I was not exposed to any religion or anything like that. And so I was a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to religion. I was doing pretty well. So I had one of those attitudes that, well, I'm doing pretty good, so I don't need a God. So if there's a God, whatever, I'm going to go and look for God whenever I actually need him. And I wanted to know, like, what is your testimony? Like, how did you, become a Christian? What is your background?
Yeah. Well, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but I did grow up in a home that where one of my parents, at least, was very religious, and that was my father, who was a Muslim. He was also a nuclear physicist. So I was exposed to science at a very early age. Science, pervaded our household, but so did my father's faith as a Muslim. And so I can remember him getting up in the morning every day, going through a ritual cleansing. Then he would lay out a prayer carpet that faced the east, and he would pray. He carried a prayer book with everywhere he went in his breast pocket. So a very religious person. And as a teenager, I became very interested in Islam, and in fact began to pursue Islam in a very serious way. And eventually, over the course of a couple of years, just became disillusioned with not Islam so much, but just disillusioned with the idea of religion, and really became what I would call an agnostic. I didn't know if God existed or not, but I didn't, like you, didn't really care if God existed. And I became, very interested in becoming a biochemist. So as a college student, I was doing the courses in chemistry and biology to prepare myself to go to graduate school to pursue a PhD in biochemistry, and embrace the evolutionary framework for origins. And that actually fueled my agnosticism, because I, like many people, I hear reason that, look, if evolution can explain everything, then God's not needed. What role does God play? God's not necessary. And that was the position I held. And then as a graduate student, really immersing myself in the study of the chemical systems that make up the cell. This is called biochemistry. Studying these systems, I was deeply impressed with not only their complexity, but really their elegance and sophistication and the ingenuity of the way these systems operated, and began to ask questions really, how do scientists explain where these remarkable systems come from? And as I delved into what's called the origin of life question, I found that that explanation was unsatisfying. It seemed to me that we were a far way from understanding the origin of life and the origin of, hence, biochemistry through evolutionary mechanisms. And it was at that point I concluded there had to be a creator of some sort, a mind that brought at least life into existence. And at that point, I began to ask the question, well, who is that mind? Do I even relate to that mind? And I found that the best answers to those questions in the gospel itself, in the Christian faith and in the gospel. And so I, converted to Christianity in large measure because I, first of all, was convinced that there was a creator. And then, being convinced that there was a creator, I was now open to hearing what the gospel really was about, and was and of course responded to the gospel, I would argue, through the work of the Holy Spirit and through Christ revealed to me through scripture and through a divine encounter with Christ.
Right. Yeah. Good. So one of the things that I have found when it comes to talking to individuals is that when people talk about evolution, they basically put a bunch of different ideas all together and basically, you know, don't differentiate between abiogenesis, macroevolution, microevolution. Would you mind giving us like some sort of like descriptions as far as like what each one of them mean and whether we have evidence for each one of them or something like that?
Sure. And the way I like to think about evolution is really to think about the nature of the evolutionary transformation that's being claimed. And so, for example, uh, one type of evolution would be microevolution. This would simply be, variation that takes place within a species. Another category that we might think about would be speciation, where one species gives rise to another, one species gives rise to another species that's closely related, a sister species, if you will. Yeah, I also, think it's valuable to think about evolution that happens at the micro level. This would be microbial evolution. The acquisition of antibiotic resistance by bacteria, as an example, or the emergence of something like the SARS-2 coronavirus through, again, host hopping. And then I also like to think about evolution uh, in terms of the origin of novelty or biological innovation. So this would be used to describe the origin of large group, major groups, or again, biological novelty, biological innovation. So we could call this macroevolution. And then the other category would be chemical evolution. This is something that I explored, as a graduate student and continue to study today. And this is the idea that that chemical processes could have generated the very first cellular entity. So we could think of that as chemical evolution. And so the point here is that these are, four, check that, five different categories of evolutionary transformations, each of which is unique. And we really want to make sure that the evidence corresponds to the nature of the transition that we're discussing. So often, many times, people will cite evidence for microevolution and say, well, this is clearly evidence that evolution is a fact. And yes, indeed, evolution is a fact when we think about evolution at that level, at that scale. But we can't take that evidence and then generalize it to say that the evolutionary paradigm or that the evolutionary worldview or the evolutionary approach to origins is valid or is legitimate overall.
So when it comes to biochemistry, which is your background and the things that you have been doing, and then for your testimony, you mentioned that you got to see the complexity of organisms and all that stuff. Like, what are some examples that you can give us that you think give us some sort of like picture that there's a creator
Right.
versus like just saying that everything happened by chance.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I experienced right away as a graduate student, working with professors and fellow graduate students, um, is that everybody was enamored in awe of biochemical systems. Everybody recognized that these systems are absolutely remarkable. They're mind-boggling. It wasn't unusual uh, for us as graduate students to get into conversations where we would talk about how cool and how amazing and how remarkable a certain feature of biochemistry is. And so everybody sees that design. I saw that design as a graduate student, but my project over the last quarter of a century, over the last 25 years, is how do we take that intuition of design and actually formalize it into a robust argument for design? And one of the first approaches that I took was to revisit the watchmaker argument of William Paley. And I think probably many people have heard of the watchmaker argument, but this is an argument that in a sense is based on analogical reasoning. Paley argued that when we look at a watch, we realize that a watch is the work of a watchmaker. And his question was why? Why do we reach that conclusion for a watch, but we don't reach the same conclusion for a rock? And he basically argued that there's certain attributes or properties that watches have that reflect the work of a creator, the work of a watchmaker. And so then when he looked at biological systems, he noted that biological systems have much more in common with a watch than they do with a rock, and therefore argued that if a watch requires a watchmaker because of these attributes, then we should conclude that there is a divine watchmaker by looking at the attributes of biological systems. And so I look to essentially revitalize and revisit that approach to arguing for design by looking at biochemical systems. And so one example that I could give you that to me, it keeps me awake at night, it's so provocative, and that is that the cell's machinery that manipulates DNA literally is operating like a computer system. And so DNA is this very large chain-like molecule. In fact, it consists of two molecular chains that align in a head-to-tail manner like this, where the backbones of the chains could be like the uprights of the ladder, and the side groups would be like the rungs of a ladder. And if you twist it in a right-handed manner, you get the well-known, DNA double helix. Well, the each of the individual chains of DNA is made up of subunit molecules called nucleotides that are joined together in a linear manner. And there are four different nucleotides that are used, abbreviated as the genetic letters A, G, C, and T. And so DNA stores information in the sequence of those genetic letters. It harbors information. And that information is digital information. There's also analog information in DNA, but we'll set that aside for a moment. But it's essentially digital information. And the cell is able to replicate DNA into two daughter molecules. It can go in and read that information and use that readout to direct the production of proteins. If there's damage to the DNA, that can repair itself. And so these three processes are in effect computer operations, where you literally have what are called biochemical Turing machines that are working collaboratively to carry out DNA replication or transcription or DNA repair. Now, this is remarkable because from our experience, we recognize that computers are really the pinnacle of our engineering achievements as human beings. And we know that computers require intelligent agents working collaboratively to build, to design, and to build. And in fact, the uh, computer operations that take place with respect to DNA are so stark in terms of, again, the comparison to actual computer operations, that it's inspired a new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing, where literally scientists are building computers from DNA and the proteins that manipulate DNA inside the cell. And these are wet computers that are housed in these little tiny Eppendorf test tubes, and they're more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based supercomputer system that we've yet to build. And so the point here is that, if we think about this in light of the watchmaker argument, the point is that, this is, again, not only provocative and intuitively suggests design, but we can actually make a formalized argument for design, tapping into the reasoning and the approach that William Paley took. And particularly given the fact that this insight has inspired new nanotechnology, that the design of how the cell manipulates DNA, that machinery, that process is so elegant and sophisticated that it's inspiring new nanotechnology. So that would be just one example of the types of design that we see in biochemical systems. I could spend hours and hours and hours going through other examples.
That's wonderful, and a lot of information actually for somebody like me who is just a layman and studies this, for fun. That just it sounds very magnificent, like how all those things function all together. Um, that's just that's pretty awesome. So I guess one of the things that I was thinking about is if you had to basically talk to somebody who is in the edge between um, taking creationism as being true or evolution, and this person is a Christian, what are some of the things that you would tell them to take under consideration as far as like challenges towards evolution?
Yeah. Well, I am often asked, why am I not an evolutionary creationist, right? And
Hmm.
and and my response is, first of all, is I see, in the incredible design in biochemistry, and I see incredible design in biology. And to me, that design suggests that there is a designer. And so the most natural way to think about that design is that there's a mind that is ultimately responsible for that design. And we're, as human beings, we're made in God's image, and when we and so we're many creators as part of the fact that we bear God's image. And to me, again, it's really interesting that we have this relationship between the designs that we build and the designs that we see in biology and biochemistry, that designs in biology and biochemistry are inspiring new advances in engineering. So there's this interplay between our work as a designer and the design that we see in biology and in biochemistry. And to me, that makes sense if we think about the fact that we are made in God's image. And so if we are creators and we produce categorically the same types of designs that we see in biology, then that, again, should be, reason to at least be open to the fact that maybe indeed creationism is the best way to think about that design, as opposed to some type of evolutionary process. But then on top of that, I also like to point out that, the key transitions that we see in life's history uh, really don't have very robust evolutionary explanations. So we talked a little bit about the origin of life. That was something that I recognized about 35 years ago, that had intractable problems that just didn't seem to me to be able to account for biochemistry. But it's not just simply the origin of life where we see problems. We also see problems when it comes to what's called the origin of eukaryotic cells. There we also see problems when it comes to how do we account for the origin of body plans. And when it comes to even our nature as human beings, our exceptional nature, we struggle to explain things like the evolutionary origin of language. So every time we see what we could consider to be the key transitions in life's history, we immediately recognize some very serious, significant problems. It's not to say that evolutionary biologists haven't proposed evolutionary models for these transitions. It's just that when we examine those models in detail, we see some very serious, significant shortcomings. And in fact, uh, uh, evolutionary biologists that are experts that are working in these areas, when you delve into their technical writings, are very quick to acknowledge and admit we really don't have a good explanation, for how these transitions take place. So, to me, it's a combination of the fact that we see elegant design, but we also struggle to explain uh, that design strictly through mechanistic, processes. It doesn't mean that evolution can't explain some features that we see in biology, but to me, it's not sufficient to explain everything that we see. And so, if I would embrace evolutionary creation, you know, I could do that and be much more in line with mainstream scientific thinking when it comes to the question of origins, but I still don't have satisfying explanations for what I think to be the most important transitions in life. So if that's the case, then why go down that path? I think it's better to pursue an approach of creationism, even if that approach isn't necessarily viewed very highly by many people in the scientific community.
So you mentioned that when scientists write their papers, they do acknowledge that they don't have any idea how some of these things took place and how they transition from one point to another. Um, what would you say, like for example, like that what is the one thing that drives scientists as well as skeptics to dismiss creationism or the idea of an intelligent being so quickly? Like, what do you think? Like, since these people or something like the scientists especially are actually acknowledging that they don't know some things. Why is it that they don't take under consideration creationism or intelligent design?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And from my perspective, the issue isn't so much the evidence at hand as really the philosophy that undergirds contemporary science. Uh, you know, um, the prevailing approach to science today is something called methodological naturalism, and that idea basically it argues that when you investigate the universe or some phenomena within the universe, that you only are allowed to present mechanistic materialistic explanations, and so you have decided a priori that the only way that you're going to, again, account for features within nature is through some kind of mechanistic process. And this is called methodological naturalism. And so the idea here is that whether you believe in God or not, you never uh, are to evoke the work of a creator, again, to account for things like the origin of life or the basic design of life or the history of life. It has to be mechanistic, which means the only possible option left is some type of evolutionary process, some kind of evolutionary mechanism. That is the only option that you have available to you. And what happens is that this philosophical framework renders science fundamentally an atheistic enterprise. Sometimes methodological naturalism is called benchtop atheism or provisional atheism, where you operate functionally as an atheist when you engage in an investigation of nature. And so, with and so you are presented with challenges to some aspect of the evolutionary paradigm that look like these challenges are intractable, or you see evidence for design that is undergirded by a robust argument for design, you can't draw the conclusion that design is the best explanation because a priori you've excluded that as a possible explanation. you categorically have dismissed that explanation before you even began your investigation. And so that to me is the primary reason why people are skeptical about creationism, is because they argue it's outside the boundaries of science, that it's inherently non-scientific, or that it's some type of pseudoscience. But yet, if you relax the restrictions imposed by methodological naturalism, you can build a robust scientific case for a creator's handiwork, at least at minimum, when it comes to the origin and the nature of biochemical systems. And in fact, you can do this using a robust scientific methodology that would be comparable to what SETI or what archaeologists are doing.
Um, One of the questions that popped into my mind was that oftentimes, whenever somebody is presenting a case for intelligent design or something like that, they always, or not always, but in most cases, they get accused of doing the God of the gaps. How do you respond to something like that? As
Yeah,
far as
go
yeah,
ahead.
like
Go ahead.
if somebody was to just accuse you of doing that, like how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I get accused of that all the time. And if our argument is essentially focused on critiquing the evolutionary paradigm or pointing out its shortcomings, and then that's where our argument stops, then that indeed is a God of the gaps argument, where we're saying evolution can't explain this, therefore a creator must have done this. And so what I've tried to do in the books that I've written is really lay out a positive case for a creator's role. And that essentially is modeled after how an archaeologist or a SETI researcher would approach the question of design detection. Because in essence, you could say SETI and archaeology are intelligent design research programs. So for example, with SETI, the objective is to determine whether electromagnetic radiation coming from a distant object is the product of some kind of natural source, or is it the product of an alien civilization, intelligent agents. And even though we may not know anything about those intelligent agents or anything about their motivation, the claim is that we can still detect evidence for agency within certain features of nature. And the way in which this is done is to first of all ask the question, does that particular feature appear to be artificial, right? The second is there any kind of known natural process mechanism that can explain that feature? And then lastly, it would be, what would it take to actually to generate that feature that we see? And so that's a three-pronged criteria that if we can check that box, each of those boxes, then we can at least argue reasonably that design or agency explains that feature in nature. So, for example, when it comes to biochemical systems, they do appear to be artificial. And I make a robust case for that in my book, The Cell's Design. In two books, Origins of Life, which I co-authored with Hugh Ross, and then Creating Life in the Lab, we explain why chemical evolution can't explain biochemical systems. That's the second check. And then in Creating Life in the Lab, I show how work to create protocells, artificial cells, requires intelligent agency as an integral component to transform chemicals into chemical supersystems that begin to assume the properties of life. And so this is a three-pronged approach that is modeled after what SETI researchers would use to establish, evidence for an alien civilization embedded in again in electromagnetic radiation. It's the same approach they would use, but I've applied that approach to biochemical systems, and have concluded that this is design. So this is a positive approach. This is not God of the gaps reasoning, but it's really abductive reasoning to the best explanation with all the evidence that we have available to us. And it's reasoning that is, again, scientific in nature. This is a scientific conclusion, not a philosophical or religious conclusion. The philosophy and the theology comes into play when we begin to broach the question, who is that agent that is responsible? But to establish agency is, strictly speaking, a scientific process. And in fact, you could even argue that extracting insight as to the capacity of that agent, or the motivation of that agent, is are also scientific questions, because you see SETI researchers doing that very thing when it comes to, again, trying to explain certain features uh, in the universe that they believe reflect alien civilizations.
Mhm. What do you think about like the idea of irreducible complexity, like something that Michael Behe talks about a lot? I think that that term was actually coined by him as well. What do you think about that stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of different ways that people have made the case for design,
Mhm.
and every approach has strengths and it has limitations. And so I think Michael Behe's approach is one approach that where he's looking at, you know, the fact that biochemical systems are irreducibly complex, and indeed they are. And one of the features of systems that are designed by human engineers, human designers, is irreducible complexity. So if we see irreducible complexity, it's not irrational to conclude that type of complexity stems from the work of a mind. So the key point here is that Behe isn't just pointing to the complexity as evidence for design, but that there's something characteristic about that complexity that suggests design. You have other people like Bill Dembski who argue for specified complexity, where there are patterns uh, that are evident within the complexity that again suggest the work of a mind. People like Doug Axe have suggested functional coherence. Um, Marcus Eblin has talked about foresight. There's evidence for foresight. In my book, The Cell's Design, I talk about an intelligent design pattern. And all of these different lines of argumentation are, in effect, restatements of Paley's approach, where Paley said what we can use to recognize the work of a creator or a designer is what he called a contrivance. Does this thing appear to be a contrivance? And so all of these different approaches that ID people and creationists have used are, in effect, variations inspired by William Paley's idea of a contrivance. These are just different ways of, in a sense, expressing the same fundamentally the same argument.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about Reasons to Believe is the fact that you guys actually are going above and beyond what other people do, which is like to actually propose a model for people to look at, and then just basically say, hey, we're doing real science here. This is how we think all this stuff works. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that, the RBT model
Sure. Yeah,
or
and
RTV? I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And just to be clear, many people get tripped up by the term model, but for a scientist, you, a model is roughly equivalent to a theory or a hypothesis, right? So you can think of hypothesis, theory, and model as not exactly the same thing, but very similar, roughly the same concept. And so one of the projects that we have at Reasons to Believe is developing what we call a testable creation model. So in other words, we basically propose, an explanation for the universe, and for the universe's origin, design, and history, for the Earth's origin, design, and history, and for life's origin and design and history, including the origin of humanity. And we drive inspiration from what Scripture teaches about God's work as creator. We derive inspiration from the different creation passages in Scripture as we essentially present our model in scientific terms. And then we develop a set of predictions about what it is we think we should discover if indeed our model is correct. Now, our model is not the creation model, it is a creation model. And so if aspects of our model, don't pan out, or they're falsified, they don't withstand ongoing scrutiny, doesn't mean the idea of a creator, is out the window. It just simply means our particular model needs to be either revised or abandoned. So, but the idea behind this approach is really to respond to a skeptic that would say, "Oh, creation isn't science, and therefore I don't need to pay attention to what you're saying because it's not scientific." And so our point is that we can actually present creation in a scientifically testable way that really invites somebody who is a skeptic and scientifically minded to really engage the ideas in a way that they are comfortable with, a way that's familiar to them. And so that's what our creation model is about. It's really presenting the ideas in a format that would be comfortable for a scientist to think about.
What are some of the predictions that your model make as far as like being different from one that will be purely secular?
Yeah. Well, one of the counters to the design argument would be so-called bad designs in biology, right? People will say, okay, yeah, yes, indeed, there are these elegant designs, but what about all these designs that are flawed, that look like they are really cobbled together by evolutionary mechanisms, that they're the vestiges of an evolutionary history? And the chief example of a bad design in biology would be junk DNA, so-called junk DNA that is found in the genomes of not only humans, but of a wide range of organisms. And the idea is that this junk DNA is the byproduct of evolutionary processes, and that the claim is that a significant portion of our genome, maybe close to 90 to 95%, is actually non-functional junk DNA that, again, reflects an evolutionary history. And so as far back as 2000, I was writing that, making the prediction that what is considered to be junk DNA will turn out to be functional, that we will eventually identify function for junk DNA. And here we are a couple of decades later, and we are now on the cusp of a revolution in biology, where more and more people are recognizing that different types of junk DNA sequences are actually functional, and are developing really elaborate explanations for why junk DNA is functional, and giving a fundamental explanation as to why these sequences, again, are the way that they are in terms of their functional role. And so based on the ENCODE project, the thought is that we could very well be looking at somewhere between 80 to close to 100% of our genome consisting of functional sequences. And so we've gone from most of our genome being junk to quite possibly most of our genome being functional. And so this is an example of a prediction we made 20 years ago that has come to pass. And from an evolutionary perspective, at that time, when we were making that prediction, most people would have argued there's no way that junk DNA could be functional, because if it was, it would violate, in effect, what's known as it would undermine the explanation for the C-value paradox. And so that's an example of two very different predictions, showing again the power of the creation model approach.
That's really interesting. Do you think that a lot of that stuff, like whenever you put question marks on like something like junk DNA, like something that that's something that they did in the past, they say, "Oh, this is not functional. There's no need for it," or something like that, or the name in itself sort of like gives it away that people just didn't think that there was much use to for it. Do you think that that has to do with perhaps the instruments that we have today, the way that we look at things, or like why do you think that people um, are finding new information now versus the past? Or I guess the connection that I'm trying to make is that evolution has changed from the idea, like, what Darwin postulated to where we are now. Like first it was Darwinism,
Right.
neo-Darwinism, and then just keeps changing. Do you think that that has to do with the data that we're getting? All that stuff is just moving forward, and now they're taking new considerations for things that perhaps in the past they just thought, man, this stuff just doesn't work. It's not something that is functional for us. I don't know if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And the thing is that's interesting to me is that when Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, it was at a point uh, in the history of biology where what we know today about biology was unknown to Darwin. And shortly after the turn of the last century, we discovered essentially or rediscovered the field of genetics, and that actually created a bit of a crisis for the evolutionary model because how do you integrate insights from genetics with evolutionary theory? And so this was called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, where evolutionary theory was revised and modified to accommodate genetics. And since that time, there have been other advances in areas of biology that have exposed fundamental understanding, like in developmental biology, for example, and in other areas of biology. And so this has led to, again, an expansion of evolutionary theory in light of these new insights, in light of these new understandings. But what's interesting is that even though, again, evolutionary theory it's a dynamic idea, it's a vibrant area of science, if you will. And even though evolutionary theory continues to expand, there are still these fundamental intractable problems that we see. And so, but that tells us is that we also have to be very careful as we, in as we offer a critique of evolution, to make sure that we're not critiquing ideas that are 20 or 30 years old, but rather that we are truly engaging, what's the current thinking in the field. So, it's our job for those of us that are in this particular area to do our best to represent the thinking. But currently there is a call on the part of many evolutionary biologists uh, to to expand evolutionary theory. This is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, where they're arguing that current evolutionary theory is crashing into some very real walls. That it's that current evolutionary theory does a great job of explaining microevolution and speciation, and but it doesn't do a great job of explaining the origin of eukaryotic cells, the origin of body plans, the origin of novelty. And if we're going to explain this, that we have to fundamentally expand and extend the evolutionary paradigm, because current mechanisms can't account for these key transitions. And so right now, you're beginning to see kind of a crisis point for evolutionary theory where thinkers in this area are being confronted with the fact that evolutionary theory has some capacity to explain what we see, but falls short when it comes to, again, trying to account for key events in life's history.
That's really interesting because most of the things that I have heard from other scientists and popularizers, like for example Neil deGrasse Tyson, he will say that evolution is a fact. Whoever denies evolution, just like they just don't get it. So I think that it's interesting that it seems like the evidence is going in an opposite direction, where like the main one of the theories that are, I guess, accepted by most scientists, like right now, which is evolution. like it seems like the evidence is just going in a different direction. So I don't know. I just find that really interesting. So thank you for that information.
Yeah, well, and I would agree with Neil deGrasse Tyson that evolution is a fact, but it depends on what you mean precisely by evolution,
Right.
right? And so many times we see what we might call the shell game of evolution, where, for example, we have evidence that as modern humans, as that we have evolved during our time on Earth. So, for example, uh, you know, some people are able to consume milk, and it's because they have the enzyme lactase that can digest milk sugar. Some people like me, are lactose intolerant. And what has happened is that uh, normally human beings will express the gene for lactase during the first 2 years of life, and then that gene is turned off, and that's during the process of weaning. Well, in some people, mutations have happened so that that gene continues to be expressed, throughout the remainder of their life. And so this is an example of an evolutionary change that has happened in humans that allowed us to domesticate plants or to domesticate animals. And as a result of that, for us to have a survival advantage. So you could say, well, here's clear evidence that humans have evolved, but that doesn't mean that that can be used to say that human evolution is a fact, because that's a very different type of evolutionary transformation you're claiming versus the idea that we have evolved, to be taller, to our eyesight has evolved to be better, all these different types of things that you can point to.
Yeah, that's interesting because, like, even with malaria and all that stuff, there has been some sort of mutations that help the individuals or close to areas where that disease is prevalent, and their bodies have changed to basically help them with all that stuff. So, yeah, I wanted to ask you one last question before we go to Q&A. We have a couple questions, and my last question would be like, why are you a Christian and say not something else like a Muslim, a Jewish person? Why Christianity?
Yeah, well, to me, I think, and I'll do this quickly, but I think when we look at the scientific evidence in totality for a creator, I think we really are driven to the point where that creator must be transcendent and personal. And so when we are in that arena now, you're looking at essentially it's either Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And to me, what distinguishes Christianity from Judaism and Islam would be the person of Christ. And so I am a Christian for two reasons. One is I think there's very good historical evidence that we can point to that Jesus indeed lived, that he was crucified, and a very good circumstantial case we can make from historical evidence that indeed the resurrection took place. I'm also a Christian because I have encountered the person of Christ, and I continue to encounter the person of Christ. And so it's those two considerations that to me indicate that it must be Christianity. But uh, when we talk about again the scientific evidence for a creator, and this is getting into the domain of Hugh Ross, if the universe has a beginning, then the cause that brought the universe into existence must exist outside the universe. He must be a transcendent cause. And when we talk about design in the universe and design in living systems, design is something that a designer produces, and designers are personal. And so we're looking at a transcendent personal cause. And again, when we consider the person of Christ, that collectively, I think, pushes Christianity to the forefront.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. We do have three questions. One of them is from Standing for Truth. I think that he mentioned something like he had you on his channel before. So the question says, how does the design model explain the existence of DNA level nested hierarchies?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And what is meant by that is that when you look at DNA, you can basically kind of categorize. Let's just use human beings as an example. You have a big category based on DNA similarities that would include humans and the great apes, right? The chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. And then there would be another category based on DNA similarities that would include gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. And then another category that would only include chimpanzees and humans. And so you've got this nested stack of DNA similarities that suggest an evolutionary history. But another way to think about this is to think about the evolution of an automobile, where automobiles are obviously things that we have designed, right? And it's a design that has changed over time. But when we look at a nested hierarchy, or sorry, check it. When we look at automobiles, we can actually see a nested hierarchy of designs. So if we look at the very first automobiles that are primitive, they have certain design elements that we see in every automobile from that point in time. But when there is innovation in automotive technology, in automotive design, that will be a new, create a new category, so that all the automobiles that follow will have not only the original, design elements, but will have these new design elements as well. And then when there's another innovation in automotive history, you will see a new type of design that is then going to be prevalent in automobiles from that point. And so you see this nested hierarchy of designs. So in other words, as designers, when we are designing systems or objects or devices, and there's a history to those systems or objects and devices where there's ongoing technological innovation, we will actually see a nested hierarchy of designs that corresponds to the time trajectory of that technology.
Really interesting. Here's another question. This one is from Islam Aran, and she's a huge fan of your ministry. She's actually friends with you, Ross, so that's pretty cool. So her question is, Dr. Ross said that you were writing a long article engaging William Lane Craig's on his theory of man's origins. Can you talk about the problem of using Heidelbergensis, I think that's what it's called.
Yes, I sure can. And by the way, I have an article that I've written that will be published in the March issue of the Christian Research Journal, where I critique that. And I've also have a much more extensive article that is kind of in the queue at Reasons to Believe. So we'll see if and when that particular article gets published. But the bottom line is that William Lane Craig argues that Adam was actually a member of Homo Heidelbergensis, and Homo Heidelbergensis was a hominin species that existed about somewhere between 500,000 and maybe 1 million years ago, that is considered to be the evolutionary ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals, which are two separate evolutionary lineages. And William Lane Craig argues that Neanderthals had cognitive abilities just like humans, and therefore should be rightly considered to be image bearers. But if you do that, because they exist as separate evolutionary lineages, you're forced to include Homo Heidelbergensis in that category. And I would actually dispute the idea that Neanderthals had cognitive abilities like us, that they had the capacity for symbolism. I would not include Neanderthals as image bearers, but I would reserve that category exclusively for anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, for us. But because William Lane Craig does that, he's forced to include Homo Heidelbergensis in order to accommodate the fact that you have two separate branches where you have, again, the qualities of being image bearers. The problem is that when we look at the brain size, the brain shape of Homo heidelbergensis, the blood flow to the brain that we can infer from the fossil record, it's very clear that Homo heidelbergensis does not have the cognitive capacity of either humans or Neanderthals, and that has no evidence for symbolism. And so I think even using William Lane Craig's own criteria, you have a problem attributing the image of God to Homo heidelbergensis. Also, there's some very real questions about whether even Homo heidelbergensis actually should even be considered to be a bona fide species. There are many anthropologists who have argued Homo heidelbergensis is actually a catch-all category where fossils that can't be categorized any other way are kind of lumped into this particular grouping if they existed at a particular window of time. And recently there was an article published by anthropologists who argued that the category of Homo heidelbergensis should be abandoned, that instead we should say that in Africa, those Homo heidelbergensis specimens should be called by a new species, Homo bodoensis, and that in Europe, the heidelbergensis specimens should be considered to be early appearing Neanderthals. And in Asia, heidelbergensis specimens represent a distinct species as well. And they argue that Homo bodoensis actually belongs in the evolutionary lineage leading to modern humans, which means you now have an unknown hominin that must be the evolutionary ancestor to humans and Neanderthals. And this is where William Lane Craig's model now gets into a problem, because what then is the category of hominins from which Adam and Eve came? And you might argue that it was a late appearing Homo erectus that actually gave rise to the two separate branches, again, viewing this in evolutionary terms. But William Lane Craig has already ruled out Homo erectus, using his analysis. And so you've got some real problems with that particular approach. Again, that was kind of a scattershot answer, but I think if you're familiar with William Lane Craig's ideas, that answer will probably make more sense than if you're not familiar with those ideas.
No, yeah, definitely. And there has been a lot of talks about everything that he has been doing lately, including his last debate with James White. So anyway, William Lane Craig has gotten quite a little bit of spotlights on himself with his last book. And I find it to be very interesting. Some people are really challenging him on that. And so that's a good answer. All right. So one last question, Dr. Rana. This one is from Islam Maran as well. And she said, or I guess it's more of a comment, you can hardly read any biological sciences paper that does not pay at least some homage to evolution. Is it hard to publish without bowing down to evolution? Or if she put evil, devo, God?
Yeah. I mean, the point you're making, Slam RN, is spot on. When you read the scientific literature, particularly when you're dealing with questions relating to the origin and the history of life, evolution is just assumed, and everything is interpreted within an evolutionary framework. And so people are not actively evaluating the evolutionary paradigm. They just are accepting it as true. And again, everything is being viewed within that framework. But it's interesting to me that it's not unusual to find papers, again, where people are approaching these questions, from an evolutionary standpoint, but acknowledge that there are uncomfortable observations that result, uncomfortable conclusions that result from this. And so there's a lot of code words that you see when you read the literature, like this result is surprising, this is an unexpected result. And these to me are code words or clues that this result isn't necessarily what you would predict within the framework of the evolutionary paradigm. But this goes back to the point we were making earlier, that if you approach the question of origins in a framework of methodological naturalism, then when you encounter these unexpected or these surprising results, you can't step back and ask the question, is the actual paradigm, the evolutionary paradigm, flawed? Is it limited in some way? Is it insufficient in some way? But rather you just have to say, well, this is an unexpected finding. This is a surprising result. And so, your point is well made.
All right. And with that, Dr. Rana, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, to me, if there is a final thought, I think that it is, important for us, who hold to the idea that there is a creator that is responsible for everything we see, that we do engage evolutionary theory. But I think we want to while we engage evolutionary theory, we really want to make sure that if we are using science as a way to advance a case for the creator, that we give more emphasis on the incredible designs that we see in biology and in biochemistry, that we give more emphasis to that than really focusing a lot of our effort on critiquing evolution. Because to me, when we start talking about the amazing designs in biology, I think it really creates a sense of awe and wonder and amazement, and out of that, I think it's very easy to introduce the idea of a creator, because that awe and that wonder and amazement is actually a sense of worship that we are evoking, from the creation itself, and that, I think, opens up people to really encountering the person of Christ.
Amen. All right. And well, with that, guys, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And thank you so much, Dr. Rana, for being with us tonight. Really appreciate it. And to all of you guys watching, thank you for being here. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.